All right. Now that we've finished talking about Bernard Williams's discussion of why immortality wouldn't be an attractive thing for us, we're going to look at a reply by a more contemporary philosopher, John Martin Fisher. Unlike Williams, who is now deceased, John Martin Fisher is actually still alive. He's a professor at the University of California at Riverside. And interestingly, Fisher just received a grant for, I believe, something like $2 million, which is a lot for a philosopher to receive, to study and sort of sponsor research work on immortality. So if you're interested in that, Google John Martin Fisher Immortality Project or something like that, and you'll get a link to the website where you can kind of learn more about what Fisher is working on and some might link you to some other work on immortality. And some of that will be philosophical work, some of it will be more scientific work. The point is just that Fisher is someone who thinks and writes and talks a lot about immortality, so he's sort of a good person to take a look at. And one thing that I really like about this article by Fisher is that after reading Williams's piece and then reading Fisher's piece, you may have noticed that Fisher writes a lot more clearly than Williams. And so one nice feature of Fisher's article is that it actually helps us to understand Bernard Williams's piece a little bit better. And one of the ways that Fisher accomplishes that is by taking Williams's conditions for an attractive immortality and just breaking them down into two sort of simple, easy to understand conditions. So let's start by taking a look at those. According to Fisher, Williams identifies two conditions for an attractive immortality, for immortality to be attractive to us. And remember, when Williams puts the point that way, he's talking about from where we are now, currently existing beings, with the character and attitudes and values that we have. What would have to be true for immortality to be attractive to us from our present position? And Fisher says, well, one of those conditions is what he calls the identity condition. It's that the future person has to be genuinely identical to the individual. It has to be the same person who's going to be immortal. And that's going to have to be true whether we're talking about a kind of Elena Macropolis, Walter Jameson type immortality, or we're talking about some sort of transcendent afterlife type immortality, or some other, there are a lot of conceptions we might think about that Williams discusses in the article that we haven't gotten into in the lecture. So when you think more about all of those as well, the point is just that this identity condition has to hold. The future immortal person has to be genuinely identical to who I am now. Otherwise, it just makes no sense to say that that sort of immortality would be attractive for us. And then the second condition that Fisher sees Williams as offering is what he calls the attractiveness condition, which is just that the life of the future person has to be attractive to the individual. It has to be attractive to us. That's sort of a simple way of putting what is otherwise seems like a really complicated point from Williams, but that's really all Williams is getting at in his discussion of Elena Macropolis, is that, look, that immortal future has to look attractive to you for immortality to be attractive. It can't be the sort of thing that you would not find appealing because you're just a different person who cares about different sorts of things. And in Fisher's analysis, we're going to talk a little bit about the identity condition towards the end, because Fisher thinks there's a sense in which what Williams is saying is true, but then Williams kind of interprets it in a way that's a little bit strange. He sort of takes certain implications to hold that don't actually hold, and this has to do with the way that our character might change. But the main target of Fisher's analysis is actually going to be this attractiveness condition. Fisher thinks that Williams is just wrong to say that an immortal existence couldn't give us categorical desires sort of continuously over time. We wouldn't run out of them in the way that Elena Macropolis does. Now, I think it's worth noting here a couple of things. One is that the way to interpret Williams is as defending the view that unattractiveness is what we might call an essential feature of immortality. And what we mean by that is that any immortal existence would count as unattractive. It's sort of inherent in the notion of immortality, is that it includes this idea of being unattractive. There's one part of the essence of immortality is that it's unattractive to beings like us, as opposed to a contingent feature, which is a feature that might vary between conceptions of immortality. Fisher thinks that that's wrong. He thinks that he thinks that unattractiveness is going to be contingent, partially on facts about the person. But Fisher does agree with Williams's two conditions here. He thinks that for an immortality to be attractive to us, it has to be the case that the immortal person is genuinely us, and their life has to be attractive to us. Fisher just disagrees that all kinds of immortality are going to fail that condition. Okay, so let's look a little bit more at the way Fisher understands Williams's complaint. According to Fisher, Williams is really positing a dilemma. And when we talk about a dilemma, what we're talking about is a situation where we've got sort of two paths that we might take, two courses of action, two possibilities, and they're both bad. So basically, no matter what we do, we end up with sort of a bad outcome. And that dilemma is supposed to go something like this. So either one's character changes over time or it doesn't. Yeah, that's just true, right? But if your character doesn't change over time, your experiences will eventually lead to this detachment and boredom. That's what we saw with Elena Macropolis, right? So that's what we call horn of the dilemma, is that if our character doesn't change, we get bored in an immortal existence. The other horn of the dilemma, premise 3 here, is that if your character does change over time, your future projects can't give rise to categorical desires now because you don't have the right kind of character for finding those desirable. So the thought is, look, even if we have sort of a different character in the future that's going to give rise to projects that future person finds interesting, who we are now isn't going to be motivated, isn't going to have reasons to go on living because of those projects, because those projects are just meaningless to who we are now. So either way we go, whether our character changes over time or not, immortality turns out to be essentially unattractive. Now, that second premise is in bold there because most of our discussion is going to be on Fisher's effort to explain why even if your character doesn't change over time, you won't get bored and become detached in the way that Williams thinks you will. Fisher's going to try to disprove that second premise. He's going to deal with what we'd call that first horn of the dilemma and show that Williams is mistaken about that. But before we talk about that, let's just briefly touch on a kind of initial complaint, or what we might call an initial beef, that Fisher has with Williams's analysis. Fisher's really concerned with how strong the criteria for the desirability of immortality, how strong that Williams has made that criteria. Williams seems to think, according to Fisher, that the only way immortality could be attractive to us is if it was constantly enjoyable, like we sort of never got bored or never had any kind of discomfort or displeasure. It was just sort of an endlessly fascinating activity, just constantly enjoyable all the time. And Fisher says, look, we should think about what the actual standard for the attractiveness of immortality should be. I mean, one thing we might start with is what makes our mortal lives attractive. And when we think about that, Fisher says, look, it's not the case that because our lives are sometimes boring or we sometimes sort of become indifferent or detached about certain features of our lives, we have sort of bad days here and there. Some of us have a lot of bad days like that, or even long periods of time where it's like that. That doesn't imply that we would rather be dead, right? That doesn't imply that we ought to just sort of, stop living. We don't stop having reasons to live just because not every moment is enjoyable, is pleasant. So the concern here is that, number one, Williams's criteria is much too strong, and what we can see that it's too strong by thinking about what makes our mortal lives enjoyable. We see that the standard Williams is applying isn't the standard that we apply to our mortal lives. So we might wonder why that's the standard for immortality. And what Fisher really focuses on with regard to this criticism, there's some language in the Williams piece where he talks about immortality as endlessly fascinating. This idea that, look, for immortality to be attractive to us, it would have to be endlessly fascinating, and we can't ever achieve that. And Fisher says, look, we should focus on three senses in which we might use this phrase, endlessly fascinating. When we say that an immortal existence would be endlessly fascinating, we might mean something like this reliability standard, that on balance, all things sort of taken into account, our life is fascinating or interesting whenever we engage in it, whenever we sort of participate in things that we care about. Like when we try, when we're involved, we enjoy it. So it's reliable in the sense that it tends to give us this sort of positive feedback whenever we put in what we should. We might also understand this notion of life being endlessly fascinating in terms of what Fisher calls density. This idea that, look, our lives are just filled with fascinating moments whenever we engage in them. Not continuously, but there's a critical mass of them. Density is an apt word here. I thought is, look, there's a lot to find fascinating. And then there's this third notion of what Fisher calls infinite extensibility, which is the idea that our lives are fascinating at every moment, and that this sort of occurs endlessly. Like, it's just nonstop amazingness, just all the time. And Fisher's criticism of Williams is that when Williams talks about an enjoyable immortality being endlessly fascinating, he seems to have in mind this idea of infinite extensibility, that an endlessly fascinating immortal life would have to be fascinating at every moment, sort of without end. And Fisher says, look, it's not clear that an immortal existence has to be endlessly fascinating in any of these senses, reliability, density, or infinite extensibility sense. It's not clear that we need to meet any of those standards, but we certainly don't need to meet the standard of infinite extensibility. That's crazy. That's way too strong of a standard. How do we know it's too strong? Because it's not the standard that we apply in our mortal lives, and we don't think that we'd be better off dead just because our lives can be boring and we can be indifferent about them and all of that. Okay, so before we move on to Fisher's main argument about self-exhausting versus repeatable pleasures, this is how he's going to sort of challenge that second premise of Williams's dilemma that we just discussed. Go ahead and complete the question, which is going to be just having a little bit to do with this initial beef that Fisher has that Williams's standard is just too strong. And then we'll move on from there.